Today I have a very important topic that I want to talk to you about, and it has to do with the heirlooms of our faith. But before I get into the details of it, I want you to know that what you're going to see on the screen will be quotations from a book that I have cherished all these years, written by Mr. Ebling, or Professor Ebling, a theologian who has since been gone for some time. A great book entitled Word and Faith. So as I speak to you, I will try to reduce what that says to a common sentence. But I wanted those quotations up there for you to ponder while I'm speaking to you today. Lamentations is an interesting book and has often been ascribed to Jeremiah. In actual fact, it is not ascribed to him at all. Jeremiah is something that has been written shortly after the fall of Jerusalem by King Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BCE. The words are very poignant, strong, and depressing. And if you're feeling sad, lonely, and dejected, read that book and you'll feel even worse. But it is a powerful book because it speaks to people who have lost their capital city, their promised religion, and their homeland. They are without hope, without faith. And Lamentations, in this particular construction that I'm sharing with you today, chapters 1, 2, and 4, form a kind of dirge. A dirge is like a mourning song of great hopelessness. But chapter 3 is an individualistic interpretation of someone's own grief. And you'll notice that in that chapter, something is said that is extraordinary to the rest of the book. And that is, no matter how much my faith has been trampled upon, no matter its challenges and the fate of its circumstances in this life, my faith is still strong because I place my hope in the Lord. It is in Yahweh, my God, that I place my absolute trust. That's all I can do in the midst of my mourning and my sadness. Now in 2 Timothy, we have a letter that supposedly Paul had written, and when I was in seminary, we would have said Paul wrote it. But there are scholars now who are disagreeing as to the authorship of this letter. It doesn't really matter, but the point is this. Timothy is starting out in his ministry. He's facing lots of problems with various congregations that he's serving, and the author is trying to get across some basic themes around how the church should manage itself with the complications that it faces. And in this particular issue, it's about faith. And you'll notice that Timothy is praised because his grandmother was very faithful. His mother was also faithful, and this has been attributed to Timothy as a good quality. He comes from a home in which faith is a regular routine of practice. But Timothy is being challenged by persecution. He's being also pressured by congregations that cannot agree amongst themselves, and he's tired and he's worn out. And this author continues to say, keep your faith, treasure the laying on of hands. That is what happens during ordination, the laying on of hands. Or when I do confirmation, I lay hands on the candidate, so that you might have the spirit of power, of love, and self-control. And that in itself is what faith is all about. And finally, in the Gospel of Luke, 2 short little stories. Jesus says, quite adequately, you want faith? You have it. All you have to do is have just enough to get through. The disciples don't understand, so he goes one step further. He says, look, you have a slave person who works as your plowman in the field. When he comes in, he doesn't expect to be fed and cared for. Because he's a slave, he has to take care of his master first. Then he feeds himself later. And he says, do what you have to do. Follow God's orders. Trust God with your life. All right, heirlooms of faith. My first point, and this is a very difficult concept to get through, and I wanted you to know that I really wrestled with it this morning in particular, because it's quite complex. And the quotation says a lot of things there, but let me try to reduce it to an experience. Faith is about embracing the future. Faith is faith because it holds on to hope, Now, I don't mean hope for hope's sake. It is a hope that somehow my faith will be rewarded. My faith will somehow affirm for me the reality that my life has not come to an end because of some kind of devastation or weakness or travesty of injustice that has happened to me. God will somehow prevail. There is a future that is waiting for me, even though I have no more strength to go forward or to put one foot in front of the other. I am bereft. And all I have is this act of trust which propels me to believe that someday things could be different. And I'll give you a simple case in point in our human history. Ernest Shackleton, you might remember him, a gentleman who went to explore the Antarctic. Well, one day he decided, just before, in fact, I think it just happened during the outbreak of World War I, he had his ship set for sail, and he was going to the Antarctic to explore and get to the South Pole. Unfortunately, he came across packed ice, which contained his ship and centered it in a certain area, and they couldn't get out for a long time. Now, they had plenty of supplies, and they waited for several months. The ship would not move. There were no strong winds. Nothing would help them. They were stranded. And Ernest Shackleton says, we can't stay here. We have to get off this ship. So they unload the whole ship, and as they are unloading it, the ship is being crushed by the ice. And Shackleton says, I've got to get you all to safety. Elephant Island is this way. So he took all the provisions and his men, loaded the boat, and went through some of the roughest weather you could possibly imagine, and they got to Elephant's Island. They unloaded the supplies. Now, Elephant Island is a desolate island. There's not much there to serve your need, let alone give you protection from the strong winds. And these men are cold, they're hungry, but they do have adequate provisions. Shackleton says, all right, I'll stay here with you for a while, roughly about a month or a little bit more. Finally, he says, we can't stay here. I have to rescue you. So what does he do next? He says, I need 5 volunteers. 5 volunteers joined him. They got on a boat, and he went to St. George's Island. The South Georgian Island, I should say. Why? Because there's a whaling ship there, and a whaling harbor, with lots of ships and supplies that they could use. He traversed that whole area, which is south of the peninsula of South America, through the rough seas. He had some of the worst seas you can imagine, 40-foot waves in some cases, strong gales and winds, and his men kept working and working and working, and I think it took them something in the order of almost 3 months to get to the other island. They get on the island. He tells the 3 to stay. He asks the other 2 to come with him. He's lost. He knows he's on the right island, but he doesn't know how to get to the whaling port because they didn't land in the proper area of the island. And so he says, let's continue our journey, and they do, and they go up these mountain ranges filled with snow up to here. And they're marching, and these men have had no sleep for at least 3 days. They're cold. They have little food left. When suddenly, Shackleton, overlooking a valley, heard a ship blowing its whistle. And he knew that was the harbor. He went to it. He got a ship, refashioned the supplies, went all the way back to Elephant Island and picked up his crew. And he saved everyone. And the key question in history has always been, what helped Ernest Shackleton to accomplish that goal? Faith. Faith that there's a future waiting for all of them. And he wasn't going to wait around to see the results. He was going to make it happen, and he took it upon himself, the grave responsibility of saving his men. His faith propelled him to believe that there would be a better day. And what is most interesting, if you read his journals or if you explore any of the history regarding the man, he never seemed to be undaunted by what he faced. But in reality, he was very afraid, sometimes uncertain and worried. But he kept believing that this can't be our outcome, in which we would be abandoned on an ice floe, or that we would be abandoned that somehow there's a future waiting for us. And one of the things about faith is that if you have faith, you're not alone. Because you're being propelled to hope for something that will be eventually better. All you have to do is move. But when you wallow, as in Lamentations, when you wallow with self-pity and forget that God is there, then you are just wasting your life away. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying you can't wallow. Everybody's entitled to a moment to feel sorry for themselves. We are. We're only human. But notice in Lamentations, the first chapter is grief. The third chapter is also grief, but it concludes with an emphasis of hope. Why? Because the author is grieving well. And when you grieve well, you retain your faith. A long time ago, in Redwater, I had to go back and bury my mother after she died from brain cancer. I came back. I only had 2 days before Christmas Eve service. And I got up and gave my sermon and service and everything else. I went home. It's Christmas Eve. I fell down at my bed and I wept. And I cried. Because I missed my mother. I felt guilty because I wasn't there to hold her hand when she died. And I can remember this instinctive feeling of something embracing me as I cried. And I cried for a good hour and a half, non-stop. Then something in me said, get up from the bed and go for a walk. So I did. It was minus 35. I bundled up and I walked the perimeter of the town when a member of my church saw me and asked me to come in. He gave me coffee and we talked about my mother. Faith demands that you move. You don't stay put. God is with you. And what has happened to you is not because of you. It's not because of what you've done. It's not because you're a sinful person and you deserve some kind of retribution. It is none of that. It is just life. Life is unfair. And all you can do is embrace the unfairness by rallying to the heroic courage of keeping what little faith you have, hoping the result will be different. Number 2, the heirloom of faith is also this. Where faith is, something happens. When you have faith, you move to something that becomes a blessing down the road for yourself and for others. Faith isn't stagnant. Faith demands that you find the courage to muster through your situation, whatever your situation may be. Because you see, part of life is to love reality for what it is. To love this life enough that you want to survive. To love this life enough to know that it's still worthy. To love life even though you feel abandoned and alone, because there is perhaps a turning point in your future. I've said this before and I'll say it again as a good example to all of you, and I'll be very brief with it. My stepfather gave me a phone call, and we were chatting for a while. And of course, over my mother's death and whatnot, and other things that were happening. And at one point, he asked me about my insurance, because I had insurance while I was married. And he says, you're putting so much money into your insurance, why don't you transfer it to something else? You could use that money for yourself. And then I said to him, but what if I marry again? He was dead silent. Now, he's a businessman. He was always very practical and pragmatic where money was concerned. Me, never was. I held on to it. I kept paying the policy. And boy, my wife will be well cared for. But here's the point. How could I say I would get married when I didn't have anybody at the time? How could I say there's a future when I had no future? Faith. And where faith is, something always happens. And my last point to you very simply is this. Do I have great faith? I suppose so. Do you have great faith? Maybe some of you. But I think the majority of us have very little faith. And if we be quite honest with ourselves, our faith is as small as a mustard seed. But that's all you need. You don't need to dramatize your piety. You don't need to be self-righteous and say you have no questions or doubts about your faith. That's not faith. Faith begins when you doubt. Faith begins when you challenge assumptions. Faith begins when you broaden your horizons beyond what you already understand so that you can see the bigger picture. Faith is always stirring and changing and molding us because it's God's activity in our life. All you have to do is trust. Trust that God will not abandon you. That God is leading you to a future which, when you're ready to move, waits for you, whatever that future will be. It's about learning. So the quotation that I have, that you have sure steps, although no road is visible, hoping although there is nothing to look for, refusing to despair although things are quite desperate, having ground under us although we step into a bottomless abyss. Faith is therefore directed towards the future. Indeed, it is really bringing about the future. Faith is knowing that the Spirit will always show you where you need to go when you least expect it. In your despair, in your anxiety, in your fear, embrace it. But at some point you need to let it go. For in letting it go, faith will take its root and show you the path that leads.